Uh, I don't know. I mean, I know that most of you have worked with Unify. Some of you probably haven't done any Angular work at all, and some of you have actually targeted the newest Angular, 6 or 5.
Yeah.
So I'll try to explain things in a way that everyone can actually understand, no matter what their experience is.
Yeah.
Okay, so within that hour, we'll try to cover some basic things which someone should know prior to doing any Angular development, to be honest, as far as I'm concerned at least.
Okay.
The most important one is project structure. Then it's the naming guidelines, how routing an application fits together with the project structure, basically. And if we have enough time left, we can cover some Angular CLI options, which will be mostly around building, not using Angular CLI. I mean, using it is not really that special. The key goals is to create a structure that will allow us to locate code quickly, seeing a view and know exactly where to go in the code. That's the whole point, and basically how compiling works in Angular. So this is a small introduction for people that don't really have much experience in Angular. So Angular is basically using modules, and it uses a tree structure to put those modules one below the other. So it basically builds relationships between those modules, and we'll see exactly how that thing works.
So is this Angular 6 only, or is it all Angular?
Is 5+, I would say.
5+.
There is some things that are explicit to 6, which I will mention at some point.
Yeah.
But at the moment, it's 5+. I mean, I'm not going to talk about the history of Angular, to be honest. It's presentation training purposes. Okay, so let's try and close that. So basically, the whole architecture of Angular is that we have modules which have a collection of providers, declarations, basically those two. Can I stand?
Yeah, sure.
It's the mouse is not visible. So in each module we can import other modules that we intend to use. In providers we import module-wide services, and we'll get that. So the thing to understand is that Angular uses dependency injection to handle everything. And for example, if you have a service injected into the routes module, that service would be available throughout the entire app, and it will be a singleton. If for any reason you inject the same service into a child module, that service will be overwritten on the child module and will be a singleton at that point and onwards for all the components inside that module. Now, if you add a provider on the component, then the service is a singleton only specifically to that component.
Okay.
I will explain what components are. Exactly. So this is what you need to have in mind. Imports, basically other modules. Exports are basically the components that this module is using, but it can export them for other modules to use. So, for example, when you import a module in imports, that means that that module actually has to export something. Else, it's like importing nothing. You can have private modules, and you can have modules like exposing. So export is what the module exposes to other modules. Bootstrap, it's a special option for reserved only for the root module, and it's basically the component that it's going to be rendered into our view, and through that component the entire app. So you have an entry type of component, but entry component is used for a different thing, which is components that are not directly part of a module, but they can be dynamically invoked through other components. For example, pop-up dialog, or something that, it's not part of our template, but it will become it. So, so the whole architecture of Angular rotates around components. It's quite similar to Angular 1, but at the same time fundamentally different. I mean, the concepts are the same, it doesn't work the same way. So you have a component, which is usually your code in TypeScript. You have your template, which is usually HTML. And I'm saying usually because you can actually, in Angular 6 and beyond, you can change the schematics and not have an HTML, for example. You can add React and have a different type of template. I don't know, there are experiments around. So, all your variables are linked with the table via property binding, and template links the variables with the components via event binding, basically. And then you have the dependency injector, which injects services into the component, and then you have the directives, which they are directly injected into your template. The major difference about Angular 1 and the new Directives 6 or 5, whatever, is that directives can no longer manipulate DOM. They cannot inject new HTML inside the DOM. They can only interact with the DOM. Change a specific style, or basically they're mostly used for styling, dynamic styling and stuff like that. If you have any questions, just
So a directive in Angular, I think when I was doing my training, you could have a directive which would have its own set of markup, and you could place that within a component, pass some data into it, and that would generate its own markup.
Yeah.
Are you saying that's directives
not possible.
can't do that now?
Like,
They're just
you can't.
You just use them as little they're almost like little, could you say like mix-ins, just to kind of set up various properties on
So
markup and things like.
the most. Okay, so how directive works in Angular? In Angular, I'll refer as Angular. There is Angular JS. Is basically we extract the DOM element from the template, and you can bind on any attribute on that DOM element and react to any change of that DOM element. They can't inject anything.
Sure.
Okay. For example, when you hover the mouse over a specific div, it can change color. That's a directive.
Okay. So you attach that directive to your template, and then when whatever event that directive was waiting for happened, it would.
So
its own behavior.
So the directive would wait for the on-mouse app, for example, and the on-mouse app is directly binded to background color. So when you hover, for example, the color changes.
Have you got an example of all of these
I have an example.
bits.
I have many examples. I don't have a directive
Right.
example
Okay. Okay.
because I couldn't think of one. There's not much CSS in my example, but yeah, we will go through the example in a moment. So, I mean, this is basically an intro to understand how.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, project structure, which is really important. So, when you create a new Angular app through the CLI, you basically get those things only. You get a source folder which has assets, environment. It has lots of config files, that's one folder, and it has an app folder which has the base module. And that's it. And now, let me give you an example on the actual thing, because it's a bit slow. Okay, yeah, that's right. Okay, so when you create a new project, you get these following folders. E2E is the end-to-end testing, not module is the dependencies. Projects is something new to Angular 6, which is basically a module that uses ng packager, which means you can export that as a library and use it on other projects. That's a new thing. And then you get source, which has the app folder, all your assets, which currently, all your environments. Environments are basically values that change based on different builds. So you can have a production environment, which has the production API URLs, and a staging environment has the staging URLs. And when you're building, those are overwritten throughout the entire application. Main TS is where everything happens. Basically, is where you actually tell Angular, which is your root module, which will in turn go into that and see what's the Bootstrap component, which is the app component in this case, which basically doesn't have anything at the moment much. It has a toolbar and a router outlet, which is used for.
Can you take us through what you went back to main.ts?
Yeah.
Can you take us through what that platform browser dynamic Bootstrap module is doing there? What's platform browser dynamic mean?
Well, it's a function of Angular which basically does that. It takes that specific module, treats it as a root module, and extracts the specific component.
Sure.
Yeah, that's what it does. Yeah, I don't have a better.
Sure, and it's telling it, and then it's saying, right, I want you to bootstrap that app module, and that's my root module.
Yeah, that's the root module.
Yeah. So could you do that with any module in
yes.
your TypeScript project, but the app's the convention? The convention sort of standard is to use app.module.ts.
Yeah.
When you're bootstrapping,
Generates like that,
Yeah, that's auto-generated.
And if you go back to app
Yeah, you can change the
module-
name. That's
Yeah,
fine. I mean, if you.
If you go back to app.module,
Okay.
did you say there was something? So bootstrap. So you said you want to bootstrap that app.module in your main.ts, but also you've got in app.module you've got that bootstrap.
Yeah.
So what's the?
So it doesn't bootstrap the
Yeah.
module. It builds the module and takes that component and bootstraps the component.
So if you wanted to choose a different module that you were going to bootstrap from main TS, would it have to be a module that
Has bootstrap.
had that bootstrap
Yes.
property? Right. Yeah.
because that's where your application.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you're saying at that point this is a module that's capable of being bootstrapped.
Bootstrapped into the view.
Okay.
It's your
So main TS is a Bootstrap,
Yeah.
and you got an app module, and that has a Bootstrap,
yeah
and that gets triggered for everything else.
yeah exactly.
And then any sub-module or any other modules, they wouldn't have that bootstrap
No.
property because they're going
Only
to be
the root module
children
can
of
have-
that module.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I had an asterisk there.
Aha, okay.
And let's say that Bootstrap is the Bootstrap component, and it only applies to root modules.
You can only have one Bootstrap, right? You can
Yes.
have an Angular embedded with another Angular.
See, theoretically you could,
Okay.
but the thing is that at the end of the day, that thing actually gets built without Angular in it. Angular gets completely removed
Right.
from at the end product.
Yeah.
So you can't dynamically bootstrap components, at least not yet.
And maybe just a practical example. So let's say we end up creating lots and lots of Angular mini pages for the portal, and then we decide one day that portal needs to be Angular. Could we just include the different smaller Angular application within that application, or would it work different?
No, it will work different. You would have to do is basically create a project, put all the modules there,
Right.
or build them with ng package there,
Yeah.
so you can have different repositories. But those modules won't have a bootstrap element. Only one, your base project will have a bootstrap element.
Okay. So one.
All the others will bind to a specific route.
Right. So you make a main application which has a Bootstrap, and everything else will be components.
Yes, components,
And
which
then-
can be either part of the application or externals.
Okay.
And you will add them into your applications via the routing, basically. There's no other way. So, one of the things I want to say is that when you create an app, you basically get only these things I just showed you. And that's because by default, Angular doesn't know what type of project you're going to build. That's the thing. It doesn't assume that you will use routing or any other features of the framework, so you can just have one page with functionality, and that's it. But Angular does provide lots of good practices to build more complex applications, because, I mean, okay, to be honest, all those modern frameworks produce so many files, so many folders, and you don't have a good structure, you're easily getting lost. The key goal for the new Angular, one of the key goals that they want to do is, you put someone which has never seen the project, knows about Angular at all, and he can immediately work on that.
That'd be fantastic.
That's
so good.
Well, that's their goal, at
Yeah.
least. I mean,
Yeah.
but in order to do that, you have to follow
Yeah.
some good practices. Okay, and part of those good practices is every complex project needs a core module. Every project needs a set module, and it needs lots of feature modules, basically. So core is the application-wide services or single-use application-wide components. Shared is components, directives, and pipes that are being used throughout the entire project and by other modules.
Why would you make all of them shared by default?
Which ones?
All of the modules. Why would you put in shared? What differentiates between a core and a shared?
No, the module needs to work as a standalone module.
Okay.
The set module doesn't have functionality by its own. It doesn't render views, it doesn't have a routing.
Okay.
It's basically, I'm using this drop down for the entire application.
Yeah.
I need to put it there, export it for everyone else
Right.
to see. Let me give you an example of that. And that applies even to external components built with from other people. So, in my example, for example, I have a material folder which I'm importing modules from an external library, and I'm just importing them and exporting them. And now everyone that uses a cert module has direct access to these components, pipes, and
Okay.
because to be honest, I mean, most projects will have common components, and you need the cert folder even if it's an external library. You can choose, and it's really important to choose that. I'll get to that. So, for example, Angular material has like 60 different modules. In this case, I'm only using 5, and that will reduce the size of the bundle in the end. Because Angular supports trace aking, and if something is not actually used, it removes it from the build process. And it's getting better at that slowly. Full screen. You know, it might sound a bit boring generally, but
Okay.
necessary. Okay, so let's see, for example, how a full structure would look like. And I took a typical example of what we're building here in charcoal. So, okay, you have core, cert, and then I've named that on purpose as layouts, which basically is public, off, and they have feature modules by themselves. The whole idea about that is you can have a module which take care of things of the access levels, for example. So you can have a public part of the app which is accessible to everyone, and then you can have a part which needs authorization, and probably, yeah. And you can have more. I mean, we can have, for example, customer level and account level in our case, and have different components and different behaviors within those. You can even share a feature by putting it into cert. So you can have the same view both in an account and a customer, but it will behave differently because it's under a specific part of the app. So in Angular 5, we usually have one other module which would be the abstractions over the HTTP client module, which is basically how you can handle REST requests. But in 6, we can actually build that as a library, and I've done that in my example to demonstrate that you can actually do that, have it completely outside the project, and it can be reused basically. That's what the libraries, the projects folder is about.
What's the benefit of moving it outside of source?
You can build it within Packager and use it in other projects. Everything that's within this project cannot be reused except if you actually copy-paste it.
Okay.
Which works fine, as we will see. You can actually move a whole module inside an Angular app, and it works as expected.
Right.
If you follow good practice. Okay, so the other thing that the Angular team is proposing as a good practice is always structure the folders like the app, like the visual thing. So if I have an app which has a sidebar with 3 options, for example here I need 3 modules, 1 for each option, And well, yeah, that's basically it.
How would the styling be shared between them?
I'll get to styling. So I can mention them here. Basically, you can't. I mean, you can have a wide application, a wide style-wide, application-wide style sheet, which can be used to render style. That's fine, but each component has its own styles.
Okay.
There is a about here. There is an option to expose the component's styling and allow the component styling to override the global one. It's generally bad practice. I mean, you have to be really careful.
Okay.
But you can actually allow specific component, for example, to override the global ones. Sometimes you need to do that because if you're using a third-party library and you just don't like the styles, because you can't really change them because you're not allowed by Angular, what you can do is allow the component to override the global one.
Is that, I found that I think on material stuff that you have to use that to override their style.
Yeah, sometimes. There are some components that have properties that allows you to change some parts of the styling. But yeah, some other parts, they're not directly accessed, so you have to do that.
Okay.
So again, the same example, one level deeper. So we have reporting. Then reporting has, for example, 2 more options. So you have 2 more modules, and they're easily linked. The visual is easily linked with the folder structure. Basically, when you're on that view, you know exactly that you have to go through reporting and exit, define exit report. And basically, that's the whole idea. Same thing, again, sorry, this is going to be, has lots of examples. So, for example, the agent report view module now has an agent report view, which I haven't included, a table and chart. So, under that, you know directly that this chart is under the agent report.
They'd be components, sorry. Or are they also modules?
Those will, yes, at some point there will be components. It depends what you're planning to build. If there's even more nested functionality, there can be modules.
Yeah.
But if that's just a chart or just a table, that's a component.
Are they linked to the actual report, or can you reuse that table in, let's say, contract report?
No, you can't reuse that.
Okay.
Is that where shared comes
That's where shared comes from.
Okay.
So you can create an abstraction of the table.
Yeah.
You can put it in shared, and then you can extend that abstraction, for example, and build something more specific.
Oh. Okay.
It's TypeScript. It's basically
Bit of inheritance.
yeah. You can have inheritance everywhere. And this slide might look similar to that one, but the basic point about this one is the Angular team proposes a rule which is called the 7 component rule, or the 7 item rule, which basically says if your view has more than 7 objects, you need to create a folder. Every folder should have maximum of 7 more folders to improve readability, basically. So in this case, because our view uses 5 components and 2 services, we are creating folders which called component services. That's the whole point. And if you, for example, have more, you can split it either to more modules or just create folders, saying that that's that part of the page.
Got a question. So you got components and services. Services are things that access external data? Or
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Service is exactly the same thing as in .NET. It's a service. It's something that does a specific job, doesn't require a view,
Yeah.
and it brings back results.
Okay.
Yes.
So it'd be like data access kind of thing, or
Yeah, it is a data access thing. So, yeah, a REST request will be inside the service.
okay.
You can put it inside a component, but that's bad practice.
Okay.
So you use create a service,
Yeah.
which I will demonstrate later, inherits my IRS interface, and
Would you still use and like pass data between different components
yes,
and modules and things and maintain
yes, but that's
state and-
where the thing I explained in the beginning comes with dependency data injection and where you are actually injecting in the service. Oh, you're not injecting, where you're initiating the service. So a service initiated in the root module will be available throughout the app. There is an exception to that rule, but every component can update that, and every component can read from that and get updated reports or even bind directly to that. And, it's fine.
Can you just extend that? Sorry, if you said we have like a root service and a component, a specific service, so the same service, are they unique instances of the same service?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So you mean if the root module has the same service and the other one has the same service?
Say if you use them as a state service, one would hold a different state to the other.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So if you inject the same service on your root module and the same service on your child module, you have two copies of the service. The child module cannot longer access the parent service.
Yeah.
It accesses its own service, its own copy of the service, and uses that. And the same thing you can do in a component. Component on the decorator, you can actually do provide and start the service there, and then it's really specific to that component. There's not many use cases for that.
Yeah.
There are some though.
Options.
Yeah, it gives you every option to do whatever you want to do. Okay. Any questions before I move to
Yeah, that's good.
this part? I'm trying to do my best. So, the other part of identifying code at a glance is naming guidelines. Really important. It allows you to change the name guidelines via tsclint if you want to, but the proposed ones are basically good enough. So the basic rules are use consistent names for symbols, use dots and dashes, dots for types and dashes for names. So, for example, it's feature name dot type dot extension
So what's it for the features?
for everything.
For everything?
For everything. The feature is, and that's an example, and more examples. Use specific naming patterns, yes, and invent types. And invent types is the most important one.
What does that mean, invent types?
So, the basic types you have in Angular is a module, component, directive, pipe,
Yeah.
and injectable. Service is not actually a thing, even though every tutorial, everything talks about services. Service is something that has the injectable decorator. But because its behavior is to manipulate data, query the APIs, print data, change data, and stuff like that, you change the name to service. Guards, for example, are injectables which implement a certain interface which is either can activate or cannot activate, which basically blocks a user from accessing a particular part of the app. So in this case, you have I don't know, authentication.gag.ts. So basically you're inventing types because you
I
want
see.
to make the app make more sense.
Yeah.
There's always another made up type. For example, resolvers were exist even in Angular 1. Resolver basically does something before the view is actually even rendered. So you can do an API request. Well, usually they're considered bad practices, but in some cases they're necessary. So you can do an API request before you even start the rendering process.
Okay.
And if that request gives you a response, then you start the rendering process.
So it is a similar way to constructor
No.
methods. What's
No.
the difference?
The rendering has already started when you're going to the constructor.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so you block construction of that component.
Yeah, so
Oh.
here with the resolver you block everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, you block the entire thing. Constructors on Angular it's a weird story. I mean, you shouldn't do anything on the constructor because that's a fine print, but Angular cannot guarantee at what point anything will happen inside the constructor.
Oh, okay.
The only thing that constructor is used is for dependency injection. So you define on the constructor which services your component is going to use, and those are getting injected, create a new component.
Okay.
But the
But-
activation is separate.
Any functionality inside the constructor is not guaranteed on any specific Angular lifecycle. Angular has engine init specifically for that, like Angular 1, which engine init is guaranteed that all binded variables will be binded at that point. So you're safe to do any operation you want. But in the constructor, yeah, you might try to access something that is not there yet.
Ah, okay.
So,
Okay. Is there anything that helps you? Can you have like a TS lint file or anything?
Yes.
To enforce those guidelines.
the name guidelines, yes.
Okay.
So TS-Lint has an extension for Angular, which by default has those specific ones.
Okay.
You can alter them and make it exactly what you want. So, okay, the rest of the guidelines, class name rules. Angular basically kind of enforces that rule, although you can override that.
What the hell is the upper camel case?
Upper camel case is camel case with the first character to be capital. But it's Pascal case
I was going to
basically.
say,
Oh,
isn't
I see.
that Pascal?
Yeah.
But Angular refers that as upper camel case.
Right.
Nice, that's
Yeah.
helpful. Thanks, Angular.
That's basically Pascal case.
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, class names need to have consistent names after their feature and functionality. Makes sense. Use the type suffix as the name of your class in most cases. In most cases, for example, contact data service.
Mhm.
That's the name you have to use. And optionally, you can ignore the suffix in injectables in general or services at end with the add. So basically, what they say is that you have to have service on all of them. You have to have type on all of them, except if they end with logger, because logger service doesn't make sense. It's a logger. Or I don't know if it makes sense, but they actually propose that. Sujan is surprised.
No, that makes sense. Yeah,
Yeah.
makes sense. Yeah,
That's what we use, right?
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
so selector name rules. So selector is a big thing. They went through different phases in selectors in Angular 1, and they finally figured out the best way to actually not have a problem with selectors. You can't change that. That's enforced, basically. you have to use lowercase characters in order to avoid problems in the selectors.
Question, what's a selector?
It's the HTML tag.
Oh, I see, alright.
So basically what happens is the component will be translated into an HTML5 element
Yeah.
and will have that specific selector which you define, and it has to be lowercase character.
Yeah.
It has to be kebab case. You can use you can use underscore. It confuses again templates. Camel case though is proposed, but it's not enforced for directives and types. But we actually suggest that you should use camel case. And to always use specific prefixes, especially on large projects, so you can actually see the name of the component inside the HTML, even when you're looking at the HTML on the build version, so you can actually know that this thing has a color or not. So basically, you have to know the component report content by.
Yeah. I was going to say, doesn't the structure tells you that, but you're talking about the rendered.
Yeah, I'm talking about the rendered.
Yeah.
So yes, the structure does tell you that.
Yeah.
But in some cases, it's easier to just, identify the element, see exactly which element has the problem. Because the structure can tell you that much. If the component is inside shared, that means it's not part of your structure. It's inside, so you can actually name it shared by chat. It's a suggestion. I think we're yeah. Should I keep on?
Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
I'm good.
There's no
Good to
time.
carry on, yeah.
Okay, I think I have enough time. It will only take 15 minutes to cover the rest of them. Okay, routing. Why is routing important? It is important because you sometimes need lots of views, but if done properly,
Well, you need to get to it.
yeah, you need to get there are rootless solutions as well.
Okay.
Anyway, it can help you identify your code quickly again. You can see the URL and know exactly what you're looking for. It can speed up the application loading. That's really important. It can speed up navigation again. It can, and it does that by splitting the compiled application into something called chunks. And it can handle chat loading strategies, basically. I'll explain that in the next slide. So here I'm trying to explain routing, to be honest. Okay, so how routing works in general, let's start from that. One of the things is this point. Route order matters, unfortunately. So basically, when you're trying to navigate a specific route, the routing module will go through every route. Rule you have defined and asks, does this route I'm looking for exist? Basically. So if you're asking something really far down the line, it goes, does that exist? No. Does that exist? No. Does that exist? No. Yes. Render. If it's an unmatched, it will go into, it's a really, it's a wildcard match, which then you can use a specific component to render basically asterisks. So you put the asterisks on the end of your rules, so it will always find a match. And when that match is found, you can render a 404, for example. So application modules can either import the entry module or lazy loaded, basically for routes. What that means is, basically I need to show you an example. It's really hard to explain.
Before you go on that, route order matters. What do you mean? Could you explain that once more? Sorry.
Yeah. So, for example, you want to direct to contact slash report slash contact.
Yeah.
For example. And like I said, the last route is a wildcard, which is an asterisk. If you put the asterisk on the front, even though there is a specific route further down the line, which is basically contact reports, we will match the wildcard.
Wildcard, okay.
It's basically how the MVC routing works. So it looks for a specific match. If it doesn't find it, it goes to the
It
wildcard.
goes to the next one,
Okay, yeah.
and it goes to the next one until it actually finds the match.
It's your route register.
Yeah. I think we had. No, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine.
We have a mess in the old intro.
That's where I was like,
Yeah.
is it the same thing? Yes.
It is the same thing.
Well,
looks like something.
yeah, but the way it's done is
Yeah. Yeah.
because you got a default route of your convention where you have accounts slash contacts, right, and then
Yeah.
go to the contacts controller by convention. But you can have contacts slash Stephanos, which is more specific. So you go to that one first rather than going to the default.
Yeah. Okay.
So yeah, that's the order.
Okay, so at least in this version, the thing is not optimized, it goes to the entire thing. It reads everything until it actually finds a match. So let's go to the app. So, like I said, there are two ways to import a module. Either directly or lazy loaded.
So what's the double asterisk for?
So that's a wildcard.
2 asterisks is like a wildcard, right?
Yeah, it's a
What about a
wildcard.
single asterisk? What does that
No, it
do?
doesn't do
Doesn't
anything.
do anything.
No, you need 2 asterisks. That's the condition. So
Okay.
that matches everything.
Right.
So
Was the first one you showed lazy loading, or that was lazy loading?
no, I haven't solved anything yet. I'm trying to find a. Yeah, no, that's just
Basic rules.
basic rules, which means first try to go to login, else go to the about page or the error page in any other app.
So,
That's an example.
sorry, question. Just are routes components as well?
No, rules are arrays
Are arrays.
of rules, basically,
Okay.
and that's what I'm saying is it follows those rules. And the complicated part is that those rules are not always visible, the order. For example, in this case, the app module imports the access layout module.
Yeah.
And in routes, there's nothing for that. Yet, the module will be loaded. And why is that? Is because it gets imported, and the important thing is that the access layout module is getting imported for the router module, which means that every routing rule that exists on the layout access module will be on top.
I see. So I can see there's a router module which uses routes,
Yes.
right? So the router module is the module that kind of uses the rules.
Yes,
Routes, okay.
those specific rules.
Yeah.
But if you go to the access layout module, you will see that there is another router module which uses other rules, the specific rules for that access layout.
Okay.
So what happens is that the access layout module gets imported first. So at that point, because we're using root module here, we're starting to compile the list of the routes, the rules, and then the route is used further down the line on the app module, which means it goes and adds more rules into the existing one. That's eager loading at the moment. What we did here is we eager load the access layout module into the app module. And the only thing we had to do is basically import it.
So when you say eager loading, you're just loading everything, even though you might not need it.
Yes. Compiling. It's a compiling thing. It doesn't. Yeah, it loads everything. It loads the JavaScript files, and even though it doesn't need that. If we go though to the access layout module, we can see. We can see two things. First of all, the access layout module doesn't import anything. If I imported the auth and public components, for example, they would be eager loaded, but I'm not importing them at all. What I'm doing is I'm including them in the rules, and I'm saying that we need to load the auth module and the public module when you try to access this specific rule.
So they're not imported until the root.
They don't even exist in the app. Your app, when it first loads, is basically your login. Nothing else exists. It hasn't downloaded the JS file for any other part of the app.
Oh, so actually you'll hit the server and download the file it needs. So.
That's where preloading strategies come. But yeah, one of the preloading strategies are when someone tries to access that route, it will hit the server, get that part of the app, bring it, and
have it cached for next time.
Yeah, and it keeps it for then.
Yeah.
So it loads once. Okay. And like I said, lazy loaded modules do not get imported. So the other thing is you can skip some things. There are many ways to actually do eager loading and lazy loading. For example, this is the other way to do eager loading. Which, if you actually, for some reason, want to import the modules, but you still need routing without having those modules enforce their routing for you, you can eager load them and then load children, for example, by using this notation, basically a function that points to that. Or you can do that and just lazy load. So that gives you, at the end, single file for the entire app, JavaScript file, and this compiles the app into chunks. And that's an example. For example, that's for the SMS reporting. So login is a module by itself. So it builds a login module and SMS reporting.
Why we got login module?
No, he names that based on the notes.
Okay.
So it
Doesn't matter, that's only for development anyway.
Okay.
Sorry. So in the example you were saying a moment ago, the first one, login module, will download first. You go as soon as you hit a.
No, that's the building. So that means what I mean is if you do that, you get lots of files.
Yeah. So
there's no strategy at this point. We haven't talked about strategies. Just mention them. So when you use that notation, you will only get one thing. You will get the main JS, which will be 1 megabyte. If you use that, you get that, and that. There's no loading at the moment, it's only building.
Sorry, I might be a bit confused, but so you know when you say that you pull relevant files from the server when those parts are.
Yeah, when you try to use the application, yeah.
Is that the separation?
Yeah, that's the separation.
Right, okay, that's what
So yeah, what will happen is when you click SMS reporting, is the server will go and fetch that file.
Yeah.
But before, we only rendered.
So are you saying when you build the project and you want to do lazy loading, it'll chunk it up into 3 files?
Yes,
And the application, when it starts, it will load them when it needs it.
depending on the strategy you would choose.
Depending
Yes.
on the strategy. Okay.
So almost done. And well, I can go through that fast. I mean, so there are many strategies. The basic strategy is when the user clicks the part of the application that he wants to go in, that file gets loaded.
Yeah.
The other strategy is that when the user doesn't do anything, when he doesn't move the mouse, for example, the app will start loading any extra modules so as to be available when he needs them.
So this is all lazy loading strategy.
Yes. Yeah, there is no strategies on eager loading. Eager loading loads the entire app
That's everything.
at once. On lazy loading, you can either load the part of the application when you click, and will stay there in the cache for next time you go there, or you can basically, when there is no much activity in the app, it will go and fetch the other parts.
Okay.
Or you can just skip all strategies altogether and it will load all of them at once, which basically you don't have any profit
Yeah.
out of that. And the last slide, sorry, it took a bit more. Some basic about the Angular CLI. I only include them just to see that. I'll explain. So basically, Angular CLI is the easy way to interact with your application. If you want to create a new app, you do it through the Angular CLI. If you want to generate a new module, you do it from the Angular CLI. Same thing for, you can create a module which already has the routing. So the routing file will be there for you if you want that. And you can generate components again with CLI.
Yeah.
So as to avoid spelling mistakes and have specific templates.
You run these commands inside each folder, right? So it creates in that folder.
Yes.
You specify it just before the name, don't you? See, it's like module or component.
So yeah, this is the other one. I mean, if you're not inside the specific folder, you can just say the name of the module, and we'll go and drop it there. It is a bit buggy.
No, it's,
I don't really use it. I mean, but I personally just generate the component or the module and just drag and drop it where it should go. Doesn't. It's a bit. It's a work in progress. The CLI is not perfect. And last slide, I'll talk about that because we started talking about that. One of the commands of Angular CLI is build, and that's the important thing. Is when you're in dev mode, you have named bundles. See, the bundles have names. Where you have limited tree shaking,
Sorry,
which
just a
means
question. How do you get into dev mode?
basically ng-build or ng-serve is dev mode. Basically.
Oh, I see. Okay.
In order to go to production mode, you have to define a configuration which has production from.
Okay.
It's only in
So
the
is it the
environments.
same code in both builds?
Yes.
Same code.
What do you mean in both builds?
So you got the dev mode and you got production mode. Would they generate the same files?
Same number of files, yes.
Same number of files?
The
Same code? Or
No, the code is different. So the mode have name bundles, so you can identify where the code is.
Okay.
You have limited tree shaking, which means the app is extremely big,
Okay.
to be honest. You have just-in-time compilation, which means the build includes the entire Angular framework. You have source maps. You don't have CSS extracts, which means each component has its own specific CSS. And you have vendor chunks, which means all external libraries render into a really specific chunk. So when you develop application loads, you don't have any of the benefits of strategies and stuff like that. Production mode has anonymous bundles, so no one knows where your code is, basically. Dead code elimination, it removes unused code, whether you like it or not. It uses ahead of time, which basically means it removes, Angular removes itself after compilation. The good thing about production code is the whole app renders as a standard JavaScript app. There's nothing framework specific anymore there. You don't have source maps, you don't have CSS extracts, which means it builds a single CSS file for the entire project. You don't have a vendor chunk anymore. Each component goes into the specified modules which are actually used. And yeah, you can select the configuration in production. Basically, it amplifies the code by default. You can say the red is the parts you cannot override. You can change all those things. For example, if you want non-anonymous bundle production, you can do that. There's no way not to pass configuration. You need to pass configuration. There's no way to deactivate amplify. It amplifies the project, it minimizes it. And it automatically deploys service workers if there are any in the project.
We had that problem. Also the problem with access on the methods. The difference between development and production was that production requires a lot more specificity about access on methods rather than.
It has a more strict checking on everything. That's what I mean.
Yes, yeah. So if
you have an event that expects 2 arguments, you have to pass 2 arguments.
Yeah.
In development mode, if you're not using the arguments, for example, you don't have to pass them, build's fine.
Can you turn that on so it kind of matches production? Because you might get into bugs in production.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the ahead of time, you can turn it on.
Alright.
And it's fine because you have the source maps, so you can actually debug.
Okay.